Github Copilot with Damian Brady.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company empowering .NET teams to be absolutely world-class through its ClearMeasure Way methodology. Quick announcement, my architect forums are going strong and signups for the next session are up. So if you lead a software team and are looking to collaborate with some peers, your other peer architect leaders, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. And if you're looking for Programming with Palermo, my video podcast, then just search in any of the directories and you'll be able to find it. My returning guest today on the show is Damian Brady. And Damian is a developer advocate manager at GitHub. And he's a developer, speaker, author, specializing in DevOps, machine learning ops, MLOps, developer process and software architecture, formerly a cloud advocate at Microsoft for about 4 years. And then also before that, a developer at Octopus Deploy. He's also received numerous Microsoft MVP awards before he actually went to Microsoft. And he has a 25-year background in software development and consulting in a broad range of industries. He is in Australia, and he co-organized the Brisbane Net User Group and launched the annual DDD Brisbane conference. Damian, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm fantastic. It's always fun coordinating Australian and U.S. time zones and the overlap, but
yeah,
it's all good.
No, I feel that.
Yeah, you start the day and I end the day, and that's how they go.
Yeah.
Now, I want to jump into GitHub Copilot with you, but just for the people who might not have, heard your previous podcast appearances on the Azure DevOps podcast, you've done a ton from Octopus Deploy and then at Microsoft and with Azure DevOps and now over at GitHub and working on Copilot now.
Yeah.
But for people who haven't heard you speak, how did you get into this line of work, and what are the kind of the high points for maybe some of the people out there developing their careers?
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't really have a long-term plan. I kind of just drifted into jobs that I enjoyed, I guess, and took opportunities at places that were doing things that I thought were cool. So I think for the most part, that started actually before Octopus Deploy when I moved to SSW, which you would probably know,
Ooh.
Adam Kogan's company based in Sydney. So started doing consulting with them and really got into public speaking about that time. And I was super new to it and pretty junior. And so it's taken, that long to get very comfortable. It takes a while. But I did enjoy doing it. I enjoyed kind of the variation of speaking to a lot of different companies about a lot of different problems. And as much as I love code, I kind of came to the impression that it's much more than just writing the lines of code. It's all the architecture and all the process around how you deliver software to customers, essentially.
Yeah.
That really interested me. And so got more into DevOps, started talking about that a lot more, moved to Octopus Deploy, who of course do an amazing product around software delivery. And I was doing a lot of public speaking and events and things with them. And then Donovan Brown kind of approached me and asked if I wanted to join the DevOps advocacy team over at Microsoft that they were building. And that was 6 years ago now, I think. And then a couple of years ago, I moved across to GitHub. Yeah, no big, glorious plan, just kind of kept moving to where I thought the best stuff was happening, I think. And I got really lucky with the places I've been.
And just doing really good work, just plugging away.
Yeah, plugging away. That's right. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we could talk about so many things, but as I understand it, you've been immersed in the Copilot initiatives that is going on at GitHub right now. And of course, at the Microsoft Build Conference and otherwise, people have heard some of the announcements, but just maybe to catch people up.
Yeah.
What is Copilot? Is it really a thing? What can people do now? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, of course. So GitHub Copilot, we describe it as like an AI pair programmer. The idea is that it sits there in your editor or in your IDE and helps you code. If you're familiar with things like IntelliSense, which most .NET devs probably would be, it's a little bit like IntelliSense on steroids. It predicts not just, what function you want to call from an object, but it predicts the next, the rest of the line of code, or even the next function, or the next, handful of lines of code. And what's surprising is how well it does this, especially when you've got an open file, which has a lot of context. Now, in the background, it's using large language models, which everybody would be pretty familiar with from things like ChatGPT. So I've immersed myself a lot in that kind of technology as well, just so I understood what I was talking about, I guess. But ultimately, all that ChatGPT and all of those large language models do is they are kind of completion engines. They just predict the next, word or word part. And it works really, really well with code because it's been trained. This is GitHub Copilot, or the large language model behind it. Because it's been trained on billions of lines of publicly available code and natural language, it seems to understand what you're trying to do when you write code, and it will basically save you time by saying, I get what you're doing here, or this is what it seems to be doing. Like, I get what you're doing here. Here's the next function. Super good for things that are boilerplate. So, if you're writing a data object class or something like that in .NET, it's really good at kind of filling out the rest of it based on the patterns you've already established, and saves huge amounts of time by doing that. So that's the kind of core product is GitHub Copilot, which does a very similar kind of autocomplete kind of thing to IntelliSense. We call it ghost text. Kind of gives you a grayed out text, and you press tab to accept it, essentially.
And so it's in Visual Studio, VS Code. Where can people get the current version today?
Yeah, so there are extensions for Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, the full version, the JetBrains suite of coding tools as well.
Okay.
Also NeoVim, and there's a couple of others popping up as well. I think it's Azure Data Explorer or something like that, which is actually kind of, it looks very much like VS Code.
Azure Data Studio.
That's the one.
Yeah, the new SQL Server and Azure Blob, all the Azure data services, the UI for that.
Yep. Yeah. So that has Copilot as an extension that you can install on there as well. So I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list. I keep finding it in other places as well. But it's pretty much wherever you code, especially as a .NET dev. Once you've got Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code and JetBrains, that's kind of, captures most people, I think.
Well, man, being for Azure Data Studio, I hate writing join statements where I have to link 4 or 5 tables together for maybe some reports, or I'm just spelunking through some data. Wow, I'm gonna go try that out. I didn't know it was available for that.
Yeah, give it a try. It's somebody not at GitHub actually pointed that out to me. It's like, oh wow, I feel like I should know that. Yeah, so
very cool. So based on the large language models and the is it literally using the OpenAI service in Azure, or is it something different?
It's using a descendant of those same models. So originally when GitHub Copilot came out, it was using a model called Codex, which was specifically, it was created by OpenAI in collaboration with Microsoft and GitHub. And it was trained and tuned very specifically on code. So Codex was very much, getting code out the door.
Yeah.
Since then, we've upgraded or moved to another model, which I understand is basically a descendant of GPT 3.5 Turbo.
Okay.
And we've found that it's actually more performant, so it's faster for one thing. So reduces the latency. It's like a 13% latency improvement over the previous model. Okay. So, which is really important when you're coding. You don't want to sit there and wait for a suggestion.
Yeah.
You want it to kind of pop up. And it's the code acceptance rate, which is one of the ways that we determine how accurate it is, how useful it is increased by about 6% over the previous model as well. But the important thing is when somebody type something in their editor and it sends some context to GitHub to get Copilot to produce a suggestion. We're not calling out to the OpenAI service. We are hosting those same models internally in GitHub. Okay. So that data never leaves GitHub. And in the case of things like Copilot for Business, or even if you just turn this off for individuals, it never even hits disk. Like we don't maintain, or we don't keep the prompts or the suggestions, so your code isn't going back into the model or anything like that. Yeah.
Well, so based on the model, there's and you mentioned ChatGPT. I talk to a lot of people, and I kind of say, "Hey, do you know what GPT stands for?" And of course, they're So I mean, with the middle, the P stand for pre-trained, generative pre-trained transformer. It needs to be pre-trained. So my question is, how have you guys decided what code is appropriate for this model, essentially this big database that you label it and dump in there so that it becomes a basis for suggestions, and not bad code getting in there and then suggesting the wrong stuff?
Yeah. So the core of the model is the same one that OpenAI has produced. That's kind of where the starting point is. There is an entire team inside GitHub who works on the prompt and discovering relevant parts of that prompt, which is actually a really hard problem, right? You have your editor open and all these tabs which have different files open, for example, and then that the code you've just written is going to be relevant to the prompt, so that's fine. But what else is going to be relevant to this large language model to give you the right information? And then how do you present that data in the prompt that you send to the large language model to get that effective result out? So this team, the prompt engineering team, is running constant experiments about how to build that context, how to build that prompt to get the best results out of the large language model. So that's one aspect of it, is just the prompt engineering part. On the other end, on the server side, once that prompt gets sent up, there are a series of filters that we run that have to run fast enough that they don't kind of, blow out our 10 to 20 millisecond, budget for a response. But they will do things like check for, well, first of all, if it even makes sense to provide a suggestion at this point. So if you're halfway through a word, maybe it doesn't make sense to send a suggestion down. Yeah. So filtering that stuff out. We do a lot of stuff with caching to save time there. There's things like language filters as well. So interestingly, if you swear at Copilot, it's not going to give you a response. And that kind of stuff happens on the other end too. So once we do get the responses, is this an appropriate response? Even things like, and I don't know the exact details here, but I would imagine even things like, is this response in a different language than what the prompt was? Because that's not going to be a useful response.
Right.
Does it contain security vulnerabilities? So there is now a filter on there to filter out anything that is, going to introduce a SQL injection attack, for example. Yeah. So there's all of these points in that story where we're trying to make sure that the code that's generated by the large language model and ultimately presented to the user are good suggestions that we want to, that people want to keep, essentially. Even measuring that is a tricky thing, especially because we don't keep that information. Like we don't keep the prompt and the suggestion. What we do keep is some kind of metadata around, hey, when we got a request from this person, which ran through this version of our models and filters and things like that, they accepted it or they rejected it.
Yeah.
And as well as like, if they accepted it a little bit later, and I don't know the exact timing, maybe 30 seconds later, is that code still there or have they removed it or have they changed some of it? And that gives us things like, acceptance rate. How often do they hit tab versus say, no, I don't want that. And also, how much of the code has been generated by GitHub Copilot too. And so if we can get those numbers going up, that's a pretty good indication that what Copilot is giving is valuable to the developer in the end. But that's a hard problem as well. Ultimately, like that's the aim though, right? Try to get useful code that people actually want to keep.
Yeah.
That's what's going to save time.
So speaking of the vision, is the vision to attempt to get one model with GitHub curated code bases that are available anyway, piped in, which I'm guessing everything that Microsoft pushes in is probably going to be part of it, and one model to rule them all? Or is the vision to have that as a base, but then let companies take their proprietary code and also feed it in and train it so that they'll get suggestions that maybe are specific to their body of work? How are y'all thinking about that?
Yeah, the difficulty with kind of parsing that data ahead of time and then building a model based on that is it can be tricky. I mean, you can do fine tuning. If we went through all of the GitHub code, and there's 100 million plus developers using GitHub at the moment, that's a lot of code.
Yeah.
If we went through and kind of filtered out the good stuff and then did some fine tuning on that filtered data set, that might work. I mean, you'd still have to use the base large language model as a base. Otherwise, you just don't get the volume.
You don't have much,
Yeah, you don't have as much as you need. I think we've mentioned that this is kind of what we're aiming for, is to allow kind of customization of what comes back. And there's a few experiments that we're running, a few proofs of concept that we've got in some, kind of private alphas that we're trying out. But along those lines of, look, here is my code base. Here's my organization's code base. Here is how we write code.
Mm-hmm.
Can we tune the responses to align better with that set of data? Now, fine tuning is one thing that you can do. You can, do another layer of fine tuning based on your own data. The difficulties with that is it's relatively expensive. It does take time and compute to do that. And the moment you finish doing that, it's out of date. So as soon as somebody pushes new code, that's now out of date.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how out of date, it might not matter really, in another 6 months. There are some other techniques, though, that we've been trying. One using embeddings, which is to simplify, you kind of index your entire code base. And so when somebody asks for a prompt, or basically a request comes up to say, hey, I need some code for this bit, it can identify the parts of your code base that contain relevant information and then include them in the prompt that it sends to GitHub Copilot or to the large language model. So it's saying, rather than saying, here's the context that I've given you from the files that are open,
mm-hmm.
Can you give me a suggestion? It's saying, here's the context from the files that are open, but also here's some relevant code from other parts of our company's code base that might be useful as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, can you give me a suggestion? And it turns out that gives you quite good results in a lot of cases. That's not a product yet, though. So obviously they're still working through exactly how that fits together. But yeah, things along those lines as well. I can imagine, if you have an import statement at the top of your file, if we knew what that library is that you're importing, and we could pull context from their docs or from that code base or the API that you have for that, and included that in the context, that's going to give you much more accurate responses as well.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a lot of other efforts around there, but I think, back to your original question, the core is always going to be that a large language model.
Mm-hmm.
That might change as we get better ones that are better at writing code. But yes, we're kind of putting things on the top to try and get a better result out of it. Is kind of where I'm seeing most of that effort going.
Now, do you know how many GitHub employees are dedicated to filtering out all of the public GitHub repositories that were from somebody taking a coding boot camp and just putting in samples as they're going through exercises?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. I imagine the filtering. Yeah, that would be a challenge. I imagine the filtering of data and the improving, the data that gets used for that is a consideration that's living somewhere in there as well. But that is something we get asked a lot. How do you know that the code that you're trained on is good code? And I think the short answer is, we can try, but we don't really. The way we know it's good code is that more people are accepting that code. Yeah. And using it. So
let's get some examples. You probably we've seen the public examples of just, how do I call a web service? And it gives you a few lines of code. But what are some other really cool prompts where you've been able to ask Copilot, hey, how do you do something? And it just gives you a spot on code.
Well, one thing we haven't mentioned is Copilot Chat as well, which is it's in public preview now, I believe. So we can enable people for that. There is a wait list that you can join. You should be able to find that if you look up GitHub Copilot Chat. It's kind of, you can think of that a little bit like ChatGPT that lives in your editor. So you can explicitly ask questions and have a conversation with it as well. Mm-hmm. I've done a bunch of demos. One of them at Build actually, where you ask it to write code for a game in HTML, and it will generate usable code in most cases. Obviously, you still need to be a developer to understand what it's done, and if there are errors with it, you need to be able to fix it. But it can pull out that. It can produce code, I guess, that will run and do that really easily. It's also good at doing things like explaining code, so highlight some code and say, what does this do? And it will give you an explanation. Mm-hmm. But also, building larger things. These days, apparently you can, I haven't actually tried this, but you can ask it, hey, what's the structure of a, Vue.js app? And it will say, oh, here's the file structure. Here's what it looks like. And you say, great, can you create that file structure for me? And it will go ahead and create all those files.
It'll create a directory of files?
Create directories in the files, yeah.
So directory in your file system?
Yeah.
Nice.
In VS Code, I've seen that going, yeah, which is quite cool.
For sure.
Yeah, ultimately that is kind of it's a chat engine basically built in, and it uses a large language model under the covers as well. Probably not exactly the same one, and it probably doesn't use exactly the same filters because it has a different target. Mm-hmm. But it can be really good at, having a bit more of a, like we say, it's an AI pair programmer, but having the conversation as you would with a pair programmer as well.
Yeah.
But whether you're using that or just what I like to call OG Copilot, which is like the original Copilot with the ghost text, if you can give it, comments that explain what you want it to do, it's generally really good at generating that code. So some of my favorite ones are, write a comment saying, can you write a function that does this? Mm-hmm. And if it's a fairly basic function, it'll almost always get it right.
Yeah.
As it's going. So let's say, create a function that reads the username from the query string and then checks the database to see whether the password's correct. And it will generate something. You find the point at which it's deviated from what you actually wanted, delete the rest of that, and then write a comment to say, okay, here's what I want you to do next. And just kind of course correct on the way through.
Right. And
you can get a long way with something like that. One of the things that I find the most fun as well is creating data in the form of, JSON or SQL insert statements or something like that, that do spoken language translation. So you can say, here's my text in English. Now write the same thing in Spanish. And it does a surprisingly good job, which is great for internationalization and things like that.
For sure.
I would obviously run it by somebody who's a native speaker to make sure that
it's editor. That's right.
A native, yeah, exactly, just to make sure it's actually accurate. But it does get you a long way with things like that. What else? Boilerplate. So if you wanted to, add a field to a data object, you add it, at the top when you're defining your internal variables, and then you go to the constructor and you just put a comma next to the first argument. And it says, oh, well, you just added that. You probably need the same name. And then inside the constructor, oh, okay, I know what you need to do now. You need to set that. So you end up just going to different points in the file and hitting tab to let it, do that work for you. I guess it's really handy to kind of do all of that boilerplate work. I think that's where I tend to use it the most.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery. ClearMeasure is also happy to be a sponsor of the video podcast, Programming with Palermo. Watch, learn, and program alongside Chief Architect Jeffrey Palermo. Videos are added weekly and available on syndicated locations supporting video podcast or by visiting palermo.network. Tune in today.
I'm wondering if there's a break. It seems like there's certain things, if I just can't quite remember what the API was that I needed to use, that seems like, okay, I'm typing and maybe I'm close, but I just can't remember, and the IntelliSense isn't popping it up. And maybe before I'd go to Stack Overflow, I'd do an internet search real quick. And that seems like a no-brainer. But if I'm thinking of like loop over this collection and add up all the integers and group them by, well, if it's something simple like that where I know exactly what to do, and I'm thinking, well, typing the prompt is kind of as many keystrokes as it is to actually type the code anyway, then I'm thinking, why don't I just talk to it? The Windows assistant, the voice assistant in transcribing into Microsoft Word and just any text box has gotten pretty good, just like the smartphones are. And are we that far off of having the integration with Windows and Visual Studio or VS Code to where if you got your mic on, you could just kind of transcribe it in there and hit tab?
So, I mean, interestingly, there is an experiment going on at the moment, or I guess it's an experimental tool inside the GitHub Next team, which is kind of our R&D team, called GitHub Copilot Voice. And we've shown this on stage. I know. We've shown it on stage, and I'll be completely honest, when we did show it on stage, it was very difficult to get that demo actually working at the time. So it was still very alpha right then, but they've definitely been working on it. The general idea, I believe, is that it's super useful for people who, for whatever reason, find it hard to type or can't type. That's kind of the main aim. Nice. I was actually talking to an MVP the other day who broke her arm. Or somebody pointed her to me actually and said, this person's broken their arm. They can't really type very well. Hey, can we get her access to Copilot Voice? And I said, sure. And so amazing. I think because of that use case, I think we made that available. Now, I don't know if she's used it. I don't know where that's sitting yet at the moment, but that is a temporary reason to use Copilot Voice. There's obviously people who have, more permanent reasons to use GitHub Copilot Voice, where it could actually be a useful tool. But even your example just then, I would love to be, typing in a file and get to a point and just say, hey, Copilot, can you loop over these? Or can you loop over this collection and pull out the first name? And then it would do that and you say, great, except then it is genuinely a tool that you partly talk to and you partly chat with, and it's right there where you need it. And that's kind of one of the guiding principles of GitHub Copilot moving forward, is to have this AI-enabled tool wherever you might want to use it, like wherever it's needed or wherever it can be of use, I guess. So some of the other future things, Copilot for pull requests. So when you're writing a pull request, I think we found that about 50% of pull requests don't have a description in them because people just find it difficult to write a description of what they've done. Yeah. So we actually have this enabled internally for some of our repositories where you write some of the description, then you say, okay, Copilot, fill out the summary of what files have changed and how. And it does a really good job of looking at what has changed in that pull request and giving a description of what's changed, and not just, line 25 changed from this to this, but moved this function out to another file to separate that function out or something like that. Or, added a function to get the, tax amount on this particular thing. So it kind of pulls out the meaning as well as what the actual code has changed. Yeah. But that can save you, a lot of time when you're building these things. And on the other end, when you're reviewing a pull request, like that's now a complete view of what has changed. And they've even experimented with things like, hey, this pull request exists. Somebody's written this new function, but there are no tests around that function. Yeah. Here's a test, by the way, or a series of tests that would test that new function. Do you want to include them in the pull requests? Which is impressive. I'd love to know how that works in the real world, but the demos I've seen of that are super impressive. Just kind of saving you time to do that stuff. But yeah. Well,
it seems like the normal things with a pull request, the questions are, yes, is it complete? Did you change just the files necessary, or did you do a resharp or reformat everything, in the as well.
Yeah.
Totally unnecessary, unrelated changes. Or with what you just did you increase the cyclomatic complexity of the application, a certain amount, which I guess would presume that you're tracking or something is tracking some type of metrics under the covers. But I'm sure that your list of feature requests for this is a mile long.
It's huge. Yeah, exactly. And some things tools like Copilot can do really well. Some things not as much. So you can. So I've seen this done. I've got a demo that does it where you highlight a section of code and then ask GitHub Copilot Chat, is this code secure? And it will say, no, it's not. This looks like it's introducing a SQL injection vulnerability. That stuff it can kind of do. But if you were looking for, hey, you're using this version of a dependency, does that have a known vulnerability? Then that's not really a tool for a large language model, for an AI tool.
Because that already exists. You already do that. Yeah.
Yes, with Dependabot. And so here's the other thing. Could Dependabot also benefit from some AI tooling where even if there isn't a known vulnerability, it could have a look at the code and say, look, this looks like it could be a problem.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to check that. Or we've seen this particular pattern in code be raised as a security vulnerability in other packages. Maybe this is something that is going to be affected with this package as well. Yeah. So AI maybe has a place in those tools as well, but specifically Copilot, where we're kind of, these tools are designed to kind of solve one problem, solve it really well, rather than be an all-encompassing single model that does all the things, I guess.
So just a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with someone who's in the middle of university studies and his parents, and he's, wanting to be a programmer. And of course, what he says is, I'm going to be an AI programmer. Like that's his, the thinking, right? And I kind of dig into that more. And his reasoning is because, I don't want to be a regular programmer because AI is going to take over and those jobs are going away. And so I just want, from someone who's actively working on products where other people might be asking, wait a minute, is this product going to literally eliminate developer jobs because we just don't need so many people to write code anymore? I want to get your take on that question.
My take on it. Yeah. So what we've been saying, and the aim of Copilot really is to basically increase your productivity, but increase your happiness as a developer as well. So there's nothing that I've seen of Copilot yet which would allow somebody who doesn't know programming at all to go ahead and write some software. That you still need to know what code looks like and what it does. That example I gave before of, hey, Copilot Chat, can you write a snake game for me? You can't just leave it at that. You have to be able to say, I need you to use, JavaScript only, and it's using an HTML5 canvas and stuff like that. So you do need to be able to give it enough information. Now that may improve to the point where you can do more and more without knowing the code. But as soon as something goes wrong, you definitely need a programmer. But that is not the aim really anyway. The aim is for Copilot to be a tool that improves your productivity, very much like IntelliSense. So we may have, probably not to the same extent, but we may have had those same arguments when IntelliSense came out. Like, well, this saves me so much time because I can just tab ahead and it gives me better and better suggestions.
Yeah.
I'm much faster than I used to be. I'm much more productive than I used to be. And the aim with Copilot is exactly that, to make you faster, more productive, but also focus on the stuff that you as a developer know how to do specifically, that an AI is not going to be able to fill in those gaps. So that domain knowledge of this is the problem we actually need to solve. And you really kind of need a developer mind to be able to do that stuff, to be able to break a problem down into its component pieces, build it with the right architecture, separate the functions out appropriately. And even if it is just describing what that function should do, being able to do that succinctly in a way that, a tool like Copilot can help you with. So what we found is that the developers who are using it are much more productive. And there's a couple of studies out there. You can have a look at the GitHub blog as well. There's a couple of things around around that we've done and other people have done. So it's not replacing developers so much as it is taking the busy work and the boring stuff away from them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of like, is it going to take jobs? I think any technology where suddenly you get the same productivity out of fewer people, the organization probably has to decide, do we just keep the same level of productivity we had before and get rid of people? Or are we able to, burn down that backlog a lot faster and build better and better products a lot faster with the people we have as well, which leads to, more income, which leads to all of that kind of stuff as well. The most succinct way I heard it described by one of the salespeople in Australia was, are you going to choose more sales or fewer salespeople? And usually that's a question that, has a pretty obvious answer, I guess. So do you choose more productivity or do you get rid of some of your developers and not worry about productivity at all?
It seems like we're so far away from that happening. For example, in the last 40 years of programming, I mean, the editors and the power of the editors 40 years ago was such that VI was such and Emacs were such major steps forward when they came out. And of course, a lot of the listeners have no idea what those are. And then you had, and then the IntelliSense. And I mean, we have so much better tools now than we had over each decade over the last 40 years, but we've never reduced programmers. And and so that trend of once we realize, I think, that something else is possible, and we're not banging our head against the computer trying to get this amount done. Now that amount is easy, and we're moving on. The businesses that we work for are just going to have more ideas for how to better serve their customers through software automation. That's what I see happening.
Absolutely. You can get an idea into the hands of customers faster and then evaluate whether it's valuable or not, which, right back to DevOps, right? Yeah. That's the idea. Can you evaluate whether this thing you've produced is valuable to the customer? Like, how fast can you do that? And this is, efficient coding is part of that whole software engineering lifecycle, right? And if you can improve the speed of that, then you can improve that whole feedback loop to be able to work out when you're delivering the right stuff. So yeah, absolutely. In specifically to this friend of yours' question about, hey, I want to be an AI programmer. Mm-hmm. I honestly, if he's talking about using AI tools with programming, I don't think he'll have a choice. You have to. Yeah. It's so obvious to me at least, but I'm very embedded in it. But it's so obvious to me at least that these are tools that have such productivity gains that whether it's GitHub Copilot or a competitive tool that does AI pair programming, it's just going to be the way that you do software engineering. Mm-hmm. Even 5 years ago, if somebody was saying, I write all my .NET code in Notepad, you'd laugh them out the door. That it doesn't matter how fast you type, that's not a productive way of doing it, right? You use the tools that are available, and these AI-enabled tools are available and contribute so much to productivity that it would be ridiculous not to use them, I suppose. So if you are a developer and you're not trying these, or at least knowing how they work, I think you're at risk of falling behind.
Yeah. I had a great conversation with him, and he had heard so much of the general AI dream about, no, this will be able to just kind of really do wide-ranging things. I kind of reminded, and he pointed back to all the gains that we've made over the decades, and I kind of bucketed some stuff for him and said, all the gains that we've made have been making way better tools that people use. None of these things have replaced a person who had to come up with an idea, come up with options to satisfy that idea, and then actually gather things together. And of course, he said, well, what about Tesla's robotics putting together cars? And I said, well, that's a tiny piece. What about the lithium mines in other countries to get the material for the batteries and then ship them on ships and get them over to the assembly line? And, it's like we have these tiny little pieces of automation, but we are so far from having a machine that can come up with an idea for something to do on its own.
Yeah, definitely. I think the benefits of being able to do some of this stuff so much faster just mean that the valuable stuff, the human thought, can be moved to something more beneficial and more valuable, I guess, rather than, I've got to write this class by hand. It's exactly like this other one, but with, a different function name or something like that. Yeah. I mean, that stuff goes away. You don't have to do that. You can do the stuff that requires human intelligence and requires ingenuity and creativity and all of that stuff that, that we're really good at and that is valuable ultimately.
In systems programming, in a lot of businesses, you got your regular applications, but then integrating with other systems ends up taking 90% of the effort. And some of that is, this vendor sends, even if you call a web service, it's just going to send you a big old blob of XML from a system that's 20 years old. And that right there is, take some example and say, okay, how do I, all those, XPath statements or, sucking it in and translating it to JSON or translating it and dumping it in a SQL Server database, just all those integration things just to get through the adapter code that's so specific to that vendor, or all the old stuff like ODBC data sources or, the overgrown access database or the old COBOL systems. It's like, I never really learned how to write that code. What should it look like? And be able to ask and iterate and test and get past that quickly, because you're not going to find a lot of the old stuff on Google anymore.
Yeah. Even new stuff that you're not familiar with. I mean, Roselle Scarlett on my team as well had this great blog post she did about using GitHub Copilot for education. I've heard that discussion about, how if people are just using Copilot to write all their code, how do they learn anything? Her position, which I love, is that she actually uses it specifically to learn stuff in a new language. So she'll have some code that she needs to write, and she would turn Copilot off, which is literally just click the face in the bottom right-hand corner. And you turn it off and you write some code. And then when you get stuck, you turn it back on again. And Copilot will say, oh, here's what you need next. And you can examine it and say, oh, okay, I see. That's how you do, this particular thing in this language that I'm not familiar with. Okay, let's accept that. And then we'll turn Copilot off. And you've learnt something, right? Yeah. You obviously, if it's something complex, you really need to make sure that you understand that it's doing the right thing, and it is doing the right thing. You're checking it, but it's a way of teaching you stuff that you didn't know before. Yeah. I've even had that before where I asked it for a solution to something just in a comment, and it gave me a solution, and immediately I was like, oh, that doesn't look the way that I thought it did. But then I looked at the code and I'm like, oh, actually, no, that probably will do that. Let's just, test that out a bit. And oh, great. I learned a new way of doing something that I hadn't known before. Sure. So it's not a net like, you're using this to replace your brain cells. You can use it to learn new things. Right.
And it seems like in all previous generations of tools, existing experts get way more out of a new generation of tool than someone that doesn't even know the basics of the field that's just been handed this turbocharged. Like, I don't care how an expert motorcycle racer being given like the next latest super awesome motorcycle, still going to win the race. And the person just learning to ride a motorcycle is going to get left in the dust or kill themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we have found, because I did a study on this as well, they have found that newer developers, like junior developers, get much more benefit out of Copilot than senior developers. I vaguely remember them talking about that it's actually, so junior developers get a lot of benefit, and then there's a bit of a dip, and then it starts to come up again slightly for senior developers, because they know exactly what to ask for. They know exactly what the
I imagine is. Wouldn't the younger developer, like right now, the younger developers be faster to adopt this than the seniors at this point in time? Maybe.
Yeah, it could be that too. I mean, there's a lot of stuff it's hard to kind of tell, I guess, unless we did kind of lots of studies and things like that, which we have been doing some. But I mean, if you think about what Copilot is really good at, it's really good at stuff that has been done a lot before. Yeah. So, hey, I need to do a loop through this thing and pull out these bits of information. It's going to be great at that. Yeah. But
Which for us, that's the easy code.
Yeah, exactly. And for a junior, like that's the stuff that is core that they need to know how to do. And so if Copilot can put that in front of them and say, this is how you do that.
That's how it should look.
That's how it should look. Yeah.
There's another point in I have kids that are writing, and of course I'm hammering it into them. In order to be a good writer, you have to read a lot of books. You have to be exposed to a lot of good literature, because then all that goes into the human brain large model. and then we figure out what to read based on everything we are right. And so even if a younger developer has something written for them because they weren't quite confident, they're reading all that code that's being put in front of them. And as long as it's good code, all of that's still going into their brain. They can't help but learn how it should look.
Yeah, you would hope so. I mean, I've heard arguments of, oh, look, they're just going to do the prompt and hit tab and ignore it and then go to the next line. I think that a lot of that comes down to whether you care about what you produce.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, you can just, under the same reasoning, you could say, I want to solve this problem, search for it on Stack Overflow and grab the first response and paste it in and then continue on with your day. Same issue. If you don't really care about what's being written, sure, this is a great way of doing that. On the flip side, I guess you fail very fast if you do that. If you're just going to accept stuff and then you run it and it doesn't work, then at least you know that immediately rather than trying a handful of things.
Well, that's not how you pass a coding interview for a new job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
So, hey, we could talk about this a lot. I'm really excited about that. I mean, this is going to change so many things.
Absolutely.
So we'll make sure to include the links that we mentioned in the show notes, but kind of wrap it up here. But man, thanks so much for coming and sharing everything that's going on with the new GitHub Copilot and soon to be GitHub Copilot Voice and Chat.
Possibly voice, chat you can sign up for right now. There's a wait list, and we've enabled maybe 300,000 odd people to the Copilot Chat wait list. So yeah, it's a lot. That's the product that is not GA, but it's closest to becoming GA, I think.
Yeah. So voice is just an experiment at this time, right?
Voice is an experiment, still very much belongs to the R&D team, the GitHub Next team, where all this stuff kind of comes from. So that and PRs and Copilot for Docs and a bunch of other things they're playing with. Actually, if you go to, I think it's GitHub Labs, GitHub Next. I'm just trying to type while I'm doing it, just to make sure I get the right one. Yeah. GitHubnext.com. You'll see all of the stuff that GitHub Next team is working on. And it's not just Copilot. It's not just AI tools. There's a whole bunch of other stuff as well.
Nice.
Yeah. So that will give you links to wait lists and things if you want to sign up and if you just want to see what stuff's there as well. It's very cool.
And now that all the DevOps tools are doing infrastructure as code and sticking their YAML and script files in GitHub, it's like, well, now the language model knows how to do all that stuff too.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly.
Well, good stuff. Good stuff. Well, hey, thanks for coming back on the podcast and visiting with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. No, always good to have a chat.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.